Second Chronicles chapter 33, let's call this one Candor and subtitle it Distress, a word that is going to come once again roughly out of the middle part of the passage, in which we were going to see the story of two kings. One, Hezekiah's son Manasseh and Manasseh's son Amon. And Manasseh is going to start out by essentially undoing the reforms of his father Hezekiah. And pretty quickly, as we mentioned in previous generations, when generational sin starts to set in, it might skip generations, but it rarely looks like the generation of failure before it. And so in this situation, Hezekiah was not so much a generation of failure, but Manasseh is going to go back to the previous generation of failure under Ahaz. And he is going to take from Ahaz's example of adding child sacrifice to all the previous sins of the failed kings before them. And he's going to add to that witchcraft. And not only is he going to add to it witchcraft, he's going to dig into the bag of greatest hits of failed kings past, and he is going to repurpose the temple that Ahaz had simply closed and vandalized, and he is going to now dedicate it to his favorite odd gods. And so in that, God is going to send him word, as we've routinely seen with these kings who have gone astray. And of course, Manasseh is going to listen. No, he's not. He's not going to listen at all, as we've routinely seen with these kings who have gone astray. But God is then going to bring intervention in the form of Assyrian intervention, or intervention by invasion. Understanding that Manasseh was not willing to hear, God is going to intervene more directly. And instead of simply having the nation invaded, he is going to carry Manasseh off into captivity, which is actually going to get his attention. And it's going to seem to be a situation in which Manasseh is like, God, oh God, I've heard of you. You were saying. And so by this time, God has gotten Manasseh's attention for the good, because he is going to give him another chance back in the kingdom of Judah, at which point Manasseh is going to take full advantage of that chance, and he is going to rebuild the things that he spent the first part of his reign destroying. He is not only going to rebuild them for empty purposes, he is essentially going to restore them to the purposes that they had when Judah was actually thriving and growing. And finally, he is going to command the people not to undermine it by going back to the old ways, but to actually continue to walk in ways or behave in ways that would actually help the nation continue to grow, as it did in previous years under Hezekiah, Jehoshaphat, Solomon, and other reformers who actually put Judah back on the map. And so he effectively restores the nation to that direction. But the problem is, even though it might catch on with his people, it does not catch on with his people, meaning his household, because his son Amon is going to be the next king of Judah, who is not going to follow in all of his dad's ways, but simply the ones that seem to give him license to do whatever he wants. And so even though Manasseh had an example of both failure and repentance, Amon, his son, is only going to follow that portion of his life that was marked by self-indulgence and failure. And he is essentially going to leave the kingdom in that condition for the next king, essentially the last great king of Judah, Josiah, who we'll see in the next chapter. But before we get to Josiah, there are a number of things that stood out to me from the reigns of Manasseh and Amon. And that's, first of all, as we seem to see God reach further into his toolbox or tool bag filled with methods of persuasion, he seems to tell Manasseh this time, if you can't hear me, you're going to feel me. Because what we left out of the description of how Manasseh was taken into custody is it's literally going to say he was taken into Assyrian captivity by not only chains, but hooks. And the way it's described, it makes it sound like they might be flesh hooks. Either way, the result was literally what we titled the chapter this week, and that is a degree of distress that got Manasseh's attention. And so in life, likewise, there are times when not just God, but he might send people who are really looking out for our best interest and trying to get our attention through words, but to the degree they can't reach us by words. There are times when God will seem to tell us, much like he seemed to tell Manasseh, if you can't hear me, you're going to feel me. And so God, please deliver us from the degree of self-destruction that leads us to a point past hearing to a time when we got to feel you in order to make a change. But even further, Manasseh reigned for a relatively long time, 50 plus years. And so we don't necessarily know how much of that time was devoted to dragging the nation into failure and how much was devoted to reform. But we do know that his son took over at 20 years of age, and he might have spent most of that 20 years seeing his dad set a horrible example. But that does not absolve Amon of guilt, because as we already mentioned, he could have simply rejected Manasseh's example altogether instead of selectively picking his favorite parts of the role models available to him. See, he had some holistic examples of what success was, and he did not choose to latch onto any of the examples of completeness that he had in men like David and Solomon, Jehoshaphat, and Hezekiah, men who sinned. And so, as we mentioned, God was giving examples of men who did not have to be perfect, but leaders who left lasting legacies of success. Understanding that part of Ammon's downfall quite possibly might have been, as we titled this series of lessons, his lack of candor. Essentially, instead of accepting not only the privilege of leadership, but also the responsibilities and the difficulties that these great kings had to overcome, he cherry-picked the best parts of leadership, thinking that he could succeed on his own terms. And his lack of candor led to his failure and the fact that he ended up with one of the shortest reigns in Judah's history. 2 years during which he undid the success of the kings before him.